Daniel Carter walked through the cold metal corridors of Luna Base 7, his boots making soft sounds against the floor with each step he took toward the maximum security wing of the detention facility that hung in orbit around Earth's moon in the year 2247, and he carried with him the weight of an assignment he did not fully understand yet. The message had come directly from Commander Lisa Morgan herself, which was unusual for a standard guard rotation, and the words still echoed in his mind as he approached the security checkpoint at the end of the long hallway that led to the cells reserved for the most dangerous prisoners humanity had ever captured. "We have a Sindari operative in holding cell 7. The commander had told him just an hour ago, her voice carrying that edge of tension Daniel had learned to recognize over his 6 years of service. "And I want you on primary watch starting tonight." Daniel had not asked why him specifically, because soldiers followed orders, and questions often led nowhere useful. But something in the commander's eyes had suggested there was more to this assignment than she was willing to share with him at that moment. He pressed his palm against the scanner and waited for the light to turn green before stepping through the reinforced doors that separated the regular facility from the place where they kept beings who could tear through ordinary walls like paper if given half a chance. The Sindari Collective had been humanity's primary adversary for nearly 40 years now, ever since first contact had gone terribly wrong and sparked a conflict that had claimed millions of lives on both sides. And Daniel had lost friends to Sindari weapons during his time in active combat zones before his transfer to this quieter posting. He had never seen one of them up close before tonight, only in combat footage and intelligence briefings that painted them as cold and calculating predators who viewed humans as nothing more than obstacles to be removed from the galaxy they considered their rightful territory. The guard he was replacing, a young woman named Katie Price, gave him a quick nod as she handed over the security tablet containing the prisoner's basic information, and her face looked pale in the artificial light of the corridor. "She hasn't moved much," Katie said in a voice barely above a whisper. "But there is something strange about her. Something I cannot quite explain." "Strange how?" Daniel asked, but Katie just shook her head and hurried past him toward the exit like she could not wait to put distance between herself and whatever waited in that cell. Daniel took a deep breath and turned to face the transparent barrier that separated him from the prisoner. And what he saw made him pause in a way that years of military training should have prevented. The Sindari woman sat perfectly still on the simple bench that served as the only furniture in her cell, her silver skin catching the dim light and reflecting it back with an almost gentle glow that seemed at odds with everything Daniel had been taught about her species. Her eyes were a deep violet color, like the last moments of sunset before darkness claimed the sky, and they were fixed directly on him with an intensity that made his heart beat faster in his chest for reasons he could not identify. She was beautiful in a way that felt both alien and strangely familiar, and Daniel found himself wondering how something that should feel threatening instead felt like coming home after a long journey. Energy shackles bound her wrists and ankles, the soft blue light of the restraints humming with enough power to knock out a charging elephant. And yet she sat there as calmly as if she were waiting for tea with an old friend. "You are finally here," she said, and her voice was like music played on instruments humans had never invented, warm and welcoming and filled with an emotion Daniel could not name. Kept his face neutral because that was what training demanded, even as confusion flooded through him at her words and the way she had spoken them, as if his arrival was something she had been anticipating for a very long time. "I am Security Officer Carter," he said in the flat tone he used with all prisoners, "and I will be your guard for the night shift." The Sindari woman smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something that made Daniel's breath catching his throat against his will. "Daniel Carter," she said, speaking his full name like it was a prayer she had repeated to herself through countless lonely nights. "I have waited 3 years to see you again, and I was beginning to fear that I never would." Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, though he did not draw the weapon, because her words had struck him harder than any physical blow could have managed. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice sharper now as training pushed back against the strange feelings trying to surface from somewhere deep inside him. "My identity is classified within this facility, and there is no way you should have access to that information. I know so much more than your name." "Daniel," she replied, her violet eyes never leaving his face as she spoke words that should have been impossible. "I know about the scar on your left shoulder from the training accident when you were 23. And I know that your sister Emily lives in the town where you both grew up in Montana. And I know that you dream sometimes of a place with 2 suns and forests, the color of my eyes." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face because everything she said was true. Details that existed in no file and no database that any Sindari could have accessed through conventional intelligence gathering. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper despite his efforts to maintain control of the situation. "My name is Valara," she said, rising from the bench and moving toward the barrier that separated them with a grace that seemed to flow like water over smooth stones. "And we have met before, though I know you do not remember it because they took those memories from you when you returned from my world 3 years ago." Daniel wanted to call her a liar, wanted to dismiss her words as the psychological manipulation that Commander Morgan had warned him the Sindari were capable of. But something inside him stirred at her name like a song he had forgotten but still knew by heart. He turned away from the cell and pulled up his service record on the security tablet with hands that trembled slightly, despite his efforts to steady them. And what he found there made the ground feel unstable beneath his feet. There in his file was a gap. 3 months of his life that should have been filled with mission reports and duty logs, but instead showed nothing but classified markers and redacted text that even his security clearance could not unlock. 3 years ago, he had apparently been somewhere doing something important enough to erase. And the Sindari woman in that cell claimed to know exactly what had happened during those missing months. Daniel looked back at Valara, who watched him with patience and something that looked remarkably like hope shining in her alien eyes. And he realized that his assignment to guard her might not have been coincidence at all. "What happened to me?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Valara pressed her palm against the barrier, her silver fingers spreading wide as if she could reach through and touch him if she just tried hard enough. "That is a story that will take time to tell," she said softly. "But I promise you, Daniel Carter, that every word of it will be the truth. Because you are the reason I allowed myself to be captured and brought to this place." The alarms did not sound and no warnings flashed across his tablet. But Daniel knew in that moment that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet comprehend, and that the woman on the other side of that barrier held answers to questions he had not even known to ask until tonight. The dreams came that night like waves crashing against the shore of Daniel's sleeping mind, vivid and strange and filled with colors he had never seen in the waking world, but somehow recognized as if they had always lived inside him. He stood in a forest where the trees reached toward twin suns that painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the leaves above him were the exact violet of Valara's eyes, rustling in a warm breeze that carried scents both alien and comforting at the same time. Someone walked beside him through those violet shadows, a figure with silver skin that caught the light of those twin suns like a mirror made of moonlight. And though he could not see her face clearly in the dream, he knew who she was with a certainty that transcended memory, They were laughing together about something, their voices mixing in the alien air like two instruments playing a melody they had practiced 1,000 times. And Daniel felt happy in a way he had not experienced since before his military service had hardened him against such simple emotions. Then the dream shattered like glass and he woke up in his quarters with his heart pounding and his sheets soaked with sweat. The fragments of that other world slipping away like sand through desperate fingers no matter how hard he tried to hold on to them. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed and buried his face in his hands, trying to make sense of what was happening to him since his first encounter with the Sindari prisoner in cell 7. 3 weeks had passed since that night, and each shift he spent guarding Valara brought new revelations that chipped away at everything he thought he knew about himself and his past. She spoke to him during the quiet hours when no other guards were nearby, sharing details about his life that she could not possibly know through any normal means of intelligence gathering. You broke your arm falling from a tree when you were 8 years old, she had told him during his second night on duty. And your mother sat by your bed in the hospital, singing the same song over and over until you fell asleep. Daniel had never told anyone about that song, not even his sister Emily, who had been too young to remember that night. And yet Valara knew the melody and hummed it softly through the barrier between them. You wanted to be a pilot when you were young, she said on another night. But your eyes were not good enough to pass the flight tests. And you cried alone in your room for hours after you received the rejection letter because you did not want anyone to see your disappointment. Each secret she revealed hit him like a punch to his chest, because these were not things written in any file or database, not things she could have extracted from captured intelligence or hacked communications. These were pieces of his soul that only he should have known. And somehow this alien woman carried them inside her like precious treasures she had been protecting for years. Daniel reported these conversations to Commander Morgan, who listened with a frown that deepened with each disturbing detail he shared about the prisoner's impossible knowledge. The Sindari are masters of psychological warfare, the commander told him in her office after his 3rd week of guard duty. And they have ways of extracting information that we do not fully understand. But these are things that were never recorded anywhere, Daniel insisted, frustration bleeding into his voice despite his efforts to remain professional. Things that only I could know because they happened when I was alone. Commander Morgan leaned back in her chair and studied him with eyes that held secrets she was not ready to reveal. What do you want me to tell you, Carter? She asked quietly. That you spent 3 months on a Sindari world 3 years ago and came back with memories so traumatic that you volunteered to have them erased. Daniel felt his stomach drop at her words because they confirmed what he had begun to suspect but had been too afraid to fully accept. Why was I there? He demanded, needing answers that had been hidden from him for too long. That information is classified above my clearance level, the commander replied, and something in her expression suggested she was not lying about this limitation. All I know is that you were part of a reconnaissance team that went dark for 3 months before emerging from Sindari space with 2 members dead and the rest requesting immediate memory wipes. The rest of my team had their memories erased too. Standard procedure for operations that go wrong in certain ways, Commander Morgan said, her voice carefully neutral in a way that told Daniel there was more she was not saying. Whatever you saw out there, whatever happened to you, it was deemed sensitive enough that forgetting was considered the kindest option. Daniel left her office with more questions than answers and a growing certainty that the kindest option had actually been the cruelest. One of all his friend Nathan Cole found him that evening in the mess hall, sliding into the seat across from him with a look of concern that Nathan had been wearing more and more frequently since Daniel's assignment to the Sindari prisoner began. I have been doing some digging, Nathan said quietly, checking to make sure no one was close enough to overhear their conversation. And I found some things in the classified archives that do not add up. What kind of things? Daniel asked, leaning forward with interest. Your reconnaissance team was sent to investigate reports of a Sindari faction that wanted peace with humanity, Nathan explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Not the hardliners who control their government, but a group that has been trying to open diplomatic channels for decades without success. Daniel thought of Valara and the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. So different from the cold calculation he had been taught to expect from her species. There is more, Nathan continued, pulling a small data chip from his pocket and pressing it into Daniel's hand beneath the table. I found references to evidence your team supposedly recovered. Proof that the war between our species was not an accident or a misunderstanding. What do you mean? Nathan's eyes darted nervously around the room before he answered. The file suggests that someone wanted this war to happen. Someone who benefits from humans and Sindari killing each other instead of working together. And your team found evidence that could expose the whole conspiracy. Daniel clutched the data chip tightly as the implications of Nathan's words washed over him like ice water. That is why they erased our memories, he realized aloud. Not to protect us from trauma, but to protect whoever is behind the war from being exposed. I think your Sindari prisoner knows the truth, Nathan said, rising from his seat as another officer approached. And I think that is why she let herself be captured and brought here. That night, Daniel stood before Valara's cell with the data chip hidden in his pocket, and a decision forming in his mind that would change everything. You said you had information that would change what I believe about the war, he said to her through the barrier. I am ready to hear it now. Valara's violet eyes filled with something that looked like relief and hope intertwined as she pressed her palm against the transparent wall between them. Then sit down. Daniel Carter, she said softly, because the truth is a heavy thing to carry, and you will need all your strength to bear its weight. And so she began to tell him the story of those missing 3 months. And with each word she spoke, the walls around his forgotten memories started to crumble and fall. That is a story that will take time to tell, she said softly. But I promise you, Daniel Carter, that every word of it will be the truth. Because you are the reason I allowed myself to be captured and brought to this place. The alarms did not sound and no warnings flashed across his tablet. But Daniel knew in that moment that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet comprehend. And that the woman on the other side of that barrier held answers to questions he had not even known to ask until tonight. Valara's voice carried through the barrier like a gentle stream, flowing over ancient stones as she wove together the threads of a story that Daniel had lived but could not remember. And each word she spoke brought flashes of images to his mind like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. Your ship crashed on my world 3 years ago, she began, her violet eyes fixed on his face, as if searching for any spark of recognition in his expression. A planet called Verith in the outer regions of Sindari space, where my people have lived in secret for generations. Daniel leaned closer to the barrier, hungry for every detail she could provide about the blank space in his memory that had haunted him since he first learned of its existence. There were 6 of you on that reconnaissance vessel. Valara continued, sent to investigate rumors of Sindari who wanted peace instead of war. And you found us hiding in the violet forests, far from the eyes of the hardliners who control our government. What happened after we crashed? Daniel asked, his voice rough with emotions he could not fully identify. 2 of your crew did not survive the impact, Valara said, sadness crossing her silver features like a cloud passing over the moon. But the 4 who remained were injured and stranded on a world controlled by enemies who would have killed them without hesitation if they had been discovered. She paused and took a breath before continuing. And Daniel could see how much these memories meant to her even after all this time. My faction found your crashed ship before the military patrols did. And we had a choice to make in that moment that would define everything that came after. You chose to help us, Daniel said. The words coming out as a statement rather than a question because somehow he knew this was true, even without his memories to confirm it. We chose to help you. Valara agreed with a small smile that made something warm bloom in Daniel's chest. Because we believe that humans and Sindari were not meant to be enemies. That the war between our peoples was a tragedy built on lies and manipulation, rather than any true conflict of interests. The conspiracy Nathan mentioned, Daniel said, remembering the data chip his friend had given him. You have proof of who is behind it. Valara nodded slowly, her expression growing serious. For 3 months. We hid your team in our village while you recovered from your injuries. And during that time, we shared with you everything we knew about the forces that had engineered the war between our species. She pressed both palms against the barrier now, leaning forward with an intensity that made Daniel's heart beat faster. There are powerful interests on both sides who profit from the conflict, she explained. Weapons manufacturers and military contractors and politicians who have built their careers on hatred and fear. And they work together in secret to ensure that peace never comes because peace would destroy everything they have built. Daniel felt sick as the implications of her words sank into his understanding like poison seeping into clean water. They started the war deliberately? He asked, needing to hear her confirm the terrible truth. The first contact between our species was sabotaged by agents working for these interests. Valara replied, what should have been a moment of wonder and possibility was twisted into tragedy and bloodshed. And both sides have been manipulated into believing the other attacked first ever since. Millions of people have died, Daniel said, his voice hollow with horror, on both sides for 40 years. Because someone wanted to get rich from our suffering. Your team discovered records of their communications. Valara continued. Evidence that names the conspirators on both the human and Sindari sides. Proof that could end the war if it reached the right ears. Where is this evidence now? Valara reached into a hidden pocket in her simple prison clothing and withdrew a small device no larger than a coin, which she held up to the light for Daniel to see. I have carried it with me since you left Verith, she said. Protected it through 3 years of running and hiding, and finally allowing myself to be captured so that I could find you again. Why me specifically? Daniel asked, though part of him already sensed the answer of Valara's eyes glistened with moisture that caught the light, like tiny diamonds as she activated the device. And suddenly Daniel heard a voice he recognized immediately because it was his own. I do not know if I will remember any of this after they take my memories. His recorded voice said from 3 years in the past. But I need to say it now while I still can. Daniel listened in stunned silence as his past self continued speaking. Valara, what we have found here changes everything. And I promise you that somehow, someway, I will find a path back to remember what happened between us. And I will help expose the truth, even if it costs me everything I have. There was a pause in the recording, and then his voice came again, softer now and filled with an emotion that made present-day Daniel's throat tighten. You asked me once what humans call it when two souls recognize each other across any distance or difference. And I told you we have many words for it. But the one that fits best is love. The recording ended and silence filled the space between them like a held breath. You recorded that the night before you left Verith, Valara said quietly, before the hardliner patrol found our location and forced us to separate. Before you were captured and returned to your people and had your memories erased to protect the conspiracy you had uncovered. Daniel stared at her through the barrier, and suddenly fragments of genuine memory began surfacing from the depths where they had been buried for 3 years. He remembered her laugh echoing through violet forests under twin suns. Remembered the feel of her silver hand in his as they walked together through her village. Remembered the way she had looked at him with those violet eyes when he had spoken that word to her for the first time, love. I remember, he whispered, and the words felt like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for far too long. Not everything, not yet, but I remember you. Valara, she pressed her forehead against the barrier, tears streaming down her silver cheeks now. I knew you would, she said. I knew that what we had was stronger than any memory wipe. Stronger than any distance or time or war could ever be. The moment shattered as alarm sirens began screaming throughout the facility. Red lights flashing in the corridor as emergency alerts appeared on Daniel's security tablet. He looked down at the screen and felt his blood run cold at the message displayed there. A Sindari fleet has been detected approaching Luna Base 7, he read aloud. They are broadcasting a single demand. They want me, Valara said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The hardliners have found out where I am, and they are coming to silence me before I can share the truth with anyone who might listen. Daniel looked from the tablet to Valara and back again, and in that moment, he made a decision that would either save everything or destroy them both. Then we need to make sure you have a chance to talk before they get here, he said, reaching for the controls that would open her cell. Commander Morgan's reinforcements arrived, like a wave crashing against the Sindari soldiers who had been closing in on Daniel's position. And suddenly, the corridor filled with the sounds of combat as human security teams engaged the enemy from multiple directions. Daniel used the chaos to move from his crumbling cover toward the command center doors, firing the last charges from his weapon at any enemy who tried to block his path until the gun clicked empty and he was forced to fight. Hand to hand, a Sindari soldier swung at him with the butt of a rifle, but Daniel ducked under the blow and drove his elbow into the alien's midsection before grabbing the weapon and using it against its former owner. Years of combat training took over as he pushed through the defenders, driven by something stronger than duty or survival instinct, driven by the knowledge that Valara was counting on him to reach her side. He burst through the command center doors to find Nathan working frantically at a damaged console while Valara stood nearby with a captured weapon, ready to defend him from anyone who might interfere. But they were not alone. A tall Sindari male stood on the far side of the room, his silver skin marked with military insignia that identified him as someone of high rank, and his violet eyes burned with cold fury as he trained his weapon on Valara. Hello, sister, the Sindari commander said, and Daniel felt his stomach drop at the implications of that word. Torvik, Valara replied, her voice steady despite the weapon pointed at her heart. I hoped it would not be you leading this assault, and I hoped you would come to your senses before it came to this. Torvik spat back, disgust dripping from every word. But instead you ally yourself with humans and betray everything our family has stood for. Daniel moved to position himself between Valara and her brother, raising his captured weapon despite knowing he was outmatched by the Sindari commanders. Superior reflexes and training. Your family has stood for lies and murder, Daniel said, his voice carrying across the room with a conviction that surprised even himself. The war between our peoples was manufactured by conspirators on both sides, who care more about profit than the millions of lives they have destroyed. Propaganda. Torvik dismissed with a wave of his free hand. Lies spread by traitors who would see our proud species bow down before human weakness. Then explain this, Nathan called out, turning from the console as systems came back online and the evidence Valara had carried for 3 years began broadcasting across every channel that could receive it. The screens throughout the command center lit up with communications between human and Sindari conspirators. Financial records showing payments flowing through secret accounts, and recorded conversations that revealed the deliberate sabotage of First Contact 40 years ago. Torvik watched the evidence play out with an expression that shifted from dismissive anger to confused denial to something that might have been the first cracks of doubt appearing in his eyes. Certainty. This could be fabricated, he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. You know it is not, Valara replied, stepping forward despite Daniel's attempt to keep her behind him. You know because you have seen things during your service that did not make sense. Orders that seemed designed to prolong the conflict rather than win it. Opportunities for peace that were mysteriously sabotaged at the last moment. The other Sindari soldiers in the room exchanged uncertain glances as the evidence continued streaming across the screens. And Daniel could see the same doubt spreading through their ranks like ripples across still water. We have been used, Valara continued, addressing all of them now rather than just her brother. Both our peoples, sacrificed on the altar of greed, by those who see us as nothing more than resources to be exploited. Even if this is true, Torvik said slowly, his weapon lowering slightly as he processed what he was seeing. Exposing it will not bring back the dead or heal the wounds of 40 years of war. No, Daniel agreed, stepping forward to stand beside Valara as he spoke. To the Sindari, who had been taught to hate him since birth, nothing can undo what has been done, but we can choose not to let it continue. He thought of all the friends he had lost, all the battles he had fought, believing he was defending humanity against monsters, when the real monsters had been hiding behind desks and counting their profits, while soldiers on both sides died for their manufactured conflict. I spent my career hating your people, Daniel said, his voice raw with emotion he could no longer contain, believing that every Sindari was a threat to be eliminated, and all that hate was built on lies told to me by the very people I trusted to lead us. He reached out and took Valara's hand in his, a gesture that made some of the Sindari soldiers gasp in shock at the intimacy between human and alien. She showed me another way, he continued, showed me that the differences between us are nothing compared to what we could accomplish together. If we stopped letting fear and manipulation control us. Torvik stared at their joined hands for a long moment, and Daniel could see the war playing out behind his violet eyes as everything he had believed struggled against the evidence he could no longer deny. Then slowly, almost painfully, the Sindari commander lowered his weapon completely and let it fall to the floor. I do not know if I can forgive what humans have done, Torvik said quietly, but I am tired of being a tool for those who profit from our suffering. One by one, the other Sindari soldiers followed their commander's lead, lowering their weapons as the broadcast continued spreading the truth across the galaxy. The fighting throughout Luna Base 7 began to cease as Sindari forces received the transmission and saw for themselves the lies that had sent them into battle. And human defenders watched in confusion as enemies who had been trying to kill them moments ago suddenly stopped fighting. It would take months for the full impact of the revelation to be felt, for the conspirators to be identified and brought to justice, for real peace talks to begin after 40 years of unnecessary bloodshed. But in that moment, standing in the damaged command center of Luna Base 7 with Valara's hand warm in his, Daniel knew that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between their species. Later, as they stood together on the observation deck, watching Earth rise over the lunar horizon, Valara leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder and asked the question that had been waiting since the chaos ended. Do you remember everything now? Daniel considered the question carefully, sorting through the memories that had returned in fragments and flashes over the past hours. Not everything, he admitted, but enough to know that what I feel for you is real, that it survived even when I could not remember why. My people call it recognition of souls. Valara said softly, the knowing that transcends memory or time or distance. Humans have a simpler word for it. Daniel replied, turning to face her and taking both her hands in his. I remember, she said with a smile that lit up her silver features. You told me once under the twin suns of Vareth, and I have carried that word in my heart ever since. And let me say it again, Daniel said, now that I can remember why it matters. He kissed her gently beneath the light of Earth and distant stars. Two souls who had found each other across the impossible divide of species and war and stolen memories, proving that some connections were stronger than any force that might try to break them when the shuttle arrived to take them to the peace conference where they would help build a new future for both their peoples. They boarded it together hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead as long as they faced them side by side, because that was what love meant. Human or Sindari or anything else, the choice to walk forward together into the unknown and trust that the journey was worth whatever it might cost. And Daniel Carter, who had once forgotten the most important thing in his life, would never forget again. The energy shackles fell from Valara's wrists with a soft hum as Daniel entered the release code, and she stepped through the barrier that had separated them with the grace of water, flowing free after being dammed for too long. "We need to reach the communications array in the command center," Daniel said as he drew his sidearm and checked the charge indicator. "If we can broadcast your evidence across all channels before the Sindari fleet arrives, the truth will spread too fast for anyone to contain." Valara nodded and fell into step beside him as they moved through the corridor toward the emergency stairwell, her movements fluid and precise in a way that reminded Daniel of trained soldiers rather than prisoners. "I was not always a diplomat," she said when she noticed him watching her. "Before I joined the peace faction, I served in our military for many years. That might come in handy," Daniel replied as the first explosion rocked the station and sent them both stumbling against the wall. The attack had begun. Emergency broadcasts filled the air with warnings and evacuation orders as Daniel and Valara ran through corridors that had become chaotic with fleeing personnel and security teams rushing to defensive positions. Commander Morgan's voice came through Daniel's communicator, sharp and demanding. "Carter, report your position immediately," she ordered. "The prisoner must be secured before the Sindari boarding parties breach the outer hall." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before responding. "The prisoner is with me, Commander, and we are heading to the communications array." "That is a direct violation of protocol," Morgan snapped. "I am ordering you to return her to custody immediately. With respect." "Commander, I cannot do that," Daniel said as another explosion shook the station. "She has evidence that could end this war, and I am going to make sure it gets out, even if it costs me my career." Static filled the channel for a long moment before Morgan spoke again, and her voice was different now, almost resigned. "I know about the conspiracy, Carter," she admitted. "I have known for years, but I never had proof, and I never had the courage to act on my suspicions." Daniel stopped in his tracks, stunned by her words. "Then help us," he urged. "Use your authority to get us to the communications array before the boarding parties cut us off." More static. And then Morgan's voice came back with something that sounded almost like hope. "Security Team 3, divert to Corridor 7 and provide escort for Officer Carter and the Sindari prisoner." She ordered over the open channel. "All other teams, focus defensive efforts on protecting the path to the command center." Nathan's voice crackled through Daniel's communicator next. "I heard everything," his friend said. "I am on my way to meet you with Team 3, and I have been waiting a long time to do something that actually matters." Daniel and Valara pressed forward through the damaged corridors, passing injured personnel being helped toward escape pods and fires that automated systems struggled to contain as the Sindari assault continued battering the station's defenses. Nathan appeared around a corner with 4 other security officers, all of them armed and wearing expressions of grim determination. "The command center is 3 levels up," Nathan reported as he fell in beside Daniel. "But intelligence says the first boarding parties have already breached and are heading for the same location. Then we need to move faster," Daniel said, breaking into a run that the others matched without hesitation. They climbed through maintenance shafts when the main stairs became impassable. fought through two small groups of Sindari soldiers who had penetrated the inner sections of the station and pushed ever upward toward the command center where the truth could finally be set free. Valara fought alongside them with skill that surprised even Daniel, disarming one Sindari soldier with a move so fast he barely saw it and using the captured weapon to provide covering fire as they advanced. "You are full of surprises," Daniel said to her during a brief pause to catch their breath. "You knew all of my surprises once," she replied with a small smile that made his heart ache with half-remembered tenderness. "Perhaps you will know them again when this is over." They reached the level of the command center to find the corridor, blocked by a squad of Sindari soldiers who had established a defensive position outside the main doors. "There are too many of them for a direct assault," Nathan observed grimly, counting at least a dozen armed enemies between them and their objective. "Then we need a distraction," Daniel said, his mind racing through possibilities until one stood out as the only real option. "I will draw their fire while the rest of you find another way in." "That is suicide," Valara objected, grabbing his arm with strength that surprised him. "I did not wait 3 years and cross the galaxy to find you again, only to watch you die in this corridor. Do you trust me?" Daniel asked, meeting her violet eyes with all the conviction he could muster. "With my life," she answered without hesitation. "Then trust me now," he said. "I have no intention of dying today. Not when I have finally found something worth living for." He kissed her forehead quickly, a gesture that felt both new and ancient at the same time, then broke cover and ran toward the enemy position while firing his weapon and shouting to draw every eye and every gun in his direction. The Sindari soldiers turned their attention to him as he had intended, and Daniel dove behind a support pillar as energy blasts scorched the air where he had been standing moments before. From the corner of his eye, he saw Nathan leading Valara and the others through a maintenance hatch that would take them around to the command center's secondary entrance. He just needed to keep the enemy focused on him long enough for them to reach the communications array and broadcast the evidence. That would change everything. A blast struck the pillar he was hiding behind, showering him with sparks and molten metal, and Daniel knew he could not hold this position much longer. Then he heard Valara's voice through his communicator. Breathless but triumphant. "We are in," she reported. "Nathan is working on the transmission systems now. The array is damaged." Nathan added with frustration in his voice, "I can fix it, but I need more time." Daniel checked his weapon's charge and found it merely depleted as another volley of enemy fire forced him to press tighter against the shrinking cover of his pillar. "How much time?" he asked, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "At least 5 minutes." Nathan replied. Daniel looked at the advancing Sindari soldiers and the smoking remains of his cover and knew that 5 minutes might as well be 5 years given his current situation. But then he heard Commander Morgan's voice cutting through the chaos. "Reinforcements are on the way, Carter," she announced. "Just hold on a little longer." Daniel smiled despite the desperate situation and prepared to fight for every second. Valara needed to finally speak the truth that had been buried for far too long. He had forgotten her once, forgotten the love they shared and the promise he had made under twin suns in a violet forest. But he would not fail her again, even if it meant standing alone against an army, to give her the chance she deserved. That was what humans did for the people they loved. And Daniel Carter was very much human.